Are we getting better at determining the source of the attack or tracking it back? Why don't we know that it's Iran or the State Security Bureau in China or some state-owned enterprise someplace trying to do its own indigenous innovation with somebody else's intellectual property?
Separate two things. First of all, what do we know? And I think we're quite good at knowing where things come from. Second is, what can we reveal publicly? That is much less than we know, because obviously we don't want to reveal everything we know, because then people will figure out how we know it. And then there's a third issue. What can you prove? Because if you're going to take action in response, the question is, are you going to have to go somewhere and explain, like we did when we went to war in Afghanistan or Iraq, here is the reason we are doing this. And that means you have to decide if you are able to prove and willing to prove what you might know, but is not going to be necessarily obvious to the outside observer. So, for example, when there was an attack on Estonia in 2007, that was a series of massive attacks designed to bring down the government and the financial networks. They emanated from Russia. The Russian government denied that it was official. They blamed it on hacktivists. How do you prove it's the government? And so part of what you've got to do is you've got to come up with a doctrine about how much, quote, proof you need and what are the standards you're going to require to be met before you take some kind of defensive or even active action in response.
Are we at a point now where a company in this room that was hacked could determine the source of the hacking to the point where they get to see whether or not perhaps it's a joint venture partner in some other country that found a vulnerability through the joint venture and hacked in? Are we at that point where at least a company could decide then, well, maybe this isn't the partner for us?
Well, certainly, I've experienced with our clients, because I'm in a firm that does, cybersecurity work, that some of our clients can track back where things have been stolen and taken. And then the question we get asked is, well, what can we do about it? And certainly, you're perfectly entitled to say, I don't want to deal with this joint venture partner anymore because they've taken my property. Some argue, well, you ought to be able to take your intellectual property back or disable the server which launched the attack. That raises all kinds of issues about collateral damage. And it's a little bit like if someone burglarizes your house, are you allowed to go into his house and take the stuff back? And what happens if you do that and you wind up hurting somebody? So I think there are a series of questions about what we can do to defend ourselves and how far we can go in what we call active defense that are both legal and policy questions that have yet to be resolved.
And what have we done when we've determined the source of a
Well, I mean, there are things we can do. I think the private sector is quite limited in what it can do. I think the U.S. government, in many cases, sometimes quietly, sometimes not so quietly, if it's a government-sponsored attack, will pass the message back, this is unacceptable. There's a whole discussion now in Washington about what are the rules of the road in terms of deterrence and in terms of retaliation, in terms of self-defense, in terms of prevention. That discussion has not, to my knowledge, been concluded. It's very much, I think, a matter that has to be seriously debated and addressed in pretty short order. And then, of course, there's traditional law enforcement. But there again, while we've brought some very successful cases, it often depends on getting the cooperation of governments that are not necessarily inclined to prosecute people in their own country that are doing this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There are organizations out there that do offer proactive services. I mean, you touched a little bit about the dangers of that, but would you say to our audience here that that's absolutely something that they shouldn't be looking at?
No, I mean, I think what we're talking about, not to be obscure, are people who say, well, look, we can track back where your stolen data has gone, and we can steal it back, we can corrupt it, we can set up what we call honeypots, where we actually create an attractive target for an adversary, and when they come in, it's like a bank robber who steals cash and then it blows up and red ink, gets all over their clothes. We can track it back, and we can they'll infect themselves. These all sound like interesting ideas in self-help. You always have to ask yourself this question: what could go wrong? If someone takes something out of a honey pot and they take it back and it corrupts and takes down a server in, let's say, France, and a hospital is connected to this server and it loses its power and people die, is your enterprise prepared to pay the liability for that? So I'm not saying that there's nothing you can do. I'm saying that it's very careful to talk about what is the worst outcome that might flow before you make the decision you want to do that.
Are these black ops, are they legal?
Well, that's the, if you do things privately, there's always a serious question about that. And one of the questions is under whose law? Because it's not just a question of is it legal under our law, it's a question of is it legal under the law of the country where the server you're attacking back on is located. In theory, it might even be is it legal in the law, according to the law of all the countries through which the electrons and the packets traveled, assuming you could figure out what those were, which is a whole separate issue for another day's discussion, which is how do you deal with a global network in a world of 100+ sovereigns with their own legal system.
You need flyover rights.
Right.
Essentially. Have you observed a use of the type of services that Michael is mentioning by a private U.S. company in an effective way?
I know there are people who offer this, and I have not done this myself.
Or by a public U.S. company?
And you know, I mean, it depends what you mean by effective. It's possible you could sting someone. You know, and I don't want to rule everything out. There are things you could do that would make it difficult or unpleasant for an adversary to come into your system because they'd be wasting a lot of time, but wouldn't necessarily pull anything back into their own system. So I don't mean to say there's nothing you can do to make life difficult for an adversary. I just mean to say you need to think about it and have a thorough understanding of the pluses and minuses before you license someone to do it.
So not just a wall, but perhaps a minefield
Yeah.
as well.